The teacup shattered against the marble floor before Alara Whitmore even understood what her mother had said. "Say it again," Alara whispered, kneeling to gather the broken pieces with trembling fingers. "Tell me I heard you wrong." Lady Margaret Whitmore did not kneel to help her. She stood tall in the doorway of the drawing room, her silk gown catching the morning light, her face carved from the same cold stone that had greeted Alara every day of her 22 years. "You heard me perfectly well," her mother said. "You will not attend the ball tonight. You will remain upstairs out of sight until your sisters have secured their matches." "Is that truly so difficult to understand?" Alara pressed a shard of porcelain into her palm, hard enough to sting, just to feel something other than the familiar ache in her chest. "I am your daughter too. You are the reason decent families whisper behind their fans when they see our carriage arrive," Lady Margaret said. "Do not test me this morning, Alara. I have enough to manage without your dramatics." The words landed exactly where they were meant to land, in the soft, unhealed place Alara had stopped trying to protect years ago. She rose slowly, smoothing her plain gray skirts, and said nothing more. There was no point. There had never been any point. By evening, the townhouse on Grosvenor Row buzzed with the particular chaos of a family preparing for the most important ball of the season. Maids rushed up and down the stairs with curling irons and ribbons. Her younger sister Rosalind laughed somewhere below, delighted with a new pair of silk gloves. Her elder sister Lucinda stood before the hall mirror in a gown the color of ripe peaches, turning this way and that, asking anyone within earshot whether she looked beautiful enough to catch the eye of a duke. Alara watched all of it from the top of the staircase, hidden in the shadow of the banister, wearing her plain gray dress with her hair pinned back in the same simple style she always wore. No one looked up. No one ever looked up. She had grown used to being invisible in her own home. It was easier that way. Easier than remembering the years before, when her father had still smiled at her, before the scandal that was never her fault had settled over the Whitmore name like a permanent stain. She had been 16 when it happened, when her cousin Gideon had spread a vicious lie about her to cover his own disgrace, claiming she had behaved improperly with a stable boy at a country house party. It was not true. Not a single word of it was true. But truth had never mattered as much as gossip, and gossip had followed her ever since, dressed up in polite smiles and cruel silences at every ball she was permitted to attend. Her father had believed the lie, or perhaps had simply found it convenient to believe. Her mother had certainly chosen to believe it, because blaming Alara was far easier than admitting that her own nephew was a liar and a coward. And so Alara had become the family's greatest shame, not because of anything she had done, but because of everything that had been done to her and never undone. "You're not even going to try tonight?" a voice asked softly. Alara turned to find Bridget, the young housemaid who had worked for the family since before the scandal, standing at the top of the stairs with an armful of linens. "I wasn't invited to try," Alara said, managing a small, tired smile. "Mother made that quite clear this morning." Bridget's face softened with something like pity, which Alara hated more than cruelty, because pity meant everyone agreed she deserved her fate. "That's not right, miss. Whatever happened all those years back, it wasn't your doing. Anyone with sense can see that." "Anyone with sense isn't attending tonight's ball," Alara said, and the joke came out sadder than she intended. She retreated to her small room at the end of the corridor, the one farthest from her sister's grand chambers, and sat by the window as the carriages began arriving below. Lanterns glowed along the street. Laughter drifted up from the front steps. She watched her mother and sisters descend to the waiting carriage, jewels catching lamplight, gowns swishing like poetry, and felt the old, familiar hollowness settle into her chest. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself this every single time, and every single time it was a small, necessary lie. An hour later, restless and unable to sleep despite the quiet house, Alara wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and made her way down to the kitchen, hoping for a cup of tea and a moment of peace. The staff had mostly gone to help with the ball preparations at the Ashcombe estate, where the event was being held, leaving the house eerily still. It was in the kitchen that she found the letter. It sat on the table where her mother must have left it that morning, half hidden beneath a stack of unopened correspondence. Alara recognized her mother's habit of discarding anything she considered unimportant, and under ordinary circumstances, she would never have touched another person's post. But something about the seal caught her eye. A crest she did not recognize, dark and severe, pressed into black wax. She should not have opened it. She knew that even as her fingers worked the seal loose. The letter was from the Duke of Ashcombe himself, addressed formally to Lord Edmund Whitmore, confirming his intention to consider a match with one of the Whitmore daughters during the season, and requesting that all eligible daughters of the household be presented to him personally, rather than through the usual channels of introduction favored by ambitious mothers. All eligible daughters, not simply Lucinda, whom her mother had been grooming for this very purpose for months, all of them. Alara's hands trembled as she read the line twice, then a third time. Her mother had clearly decided that this particular instruction did not apply to her, that all eligible daughters quietly excluded the one daughter she wished had never been born into scandal. It was such a small, quiet cruelty, buried in the simple act of leaving a letter unread and unmentioned, that Alara almost laughed at how unsurprised she was. She sat at the kitchen table for a long while after that, staring at the letter, feeling something shift inside her that she did not have a name for yet. It was not hope, not exactly. Hope required a kind of trust she had stopped extending to the world years ago. It was something smaller and stranger, a flicker of stubbornness, perhaps, or simple curiosity about a man the whole of London seemed to fear. Everyone spoke of the Duke of Ashcombe in the same hushed, careful tone people used for approaching storms. He was said to be cold beyond reason, having buried his young wife 2 years prior and never once shown a flicker of warmth since. He ran his estates with ruthless precision, dismissed servants who displeased him without a second thought, and had turned away 3 separate marriage proposals from families far more respected than the Whitmores. Mothers across London both feared him and coveted him in equal measure, because whatever his reputation, his title and fortune were undeniable, and rumor claimed he intended to remarry before the year's end for the sake of an heir. Alara had heard all of this the way one hears whether reports for a country one will never visit. It had never occurred to her that the Duke of Ashcombe might have any bearing on her own small, quiet life. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back exactly where she had found it, though her mind would not settle. Sleep did not come easily that night. She lay awake listening to the distant sound of carriages returning long after midnight, her sister's excited chatter drifting up the stairwell as they recounted every dance, every compliment, every moment of the evening she had not been permitted to witness. She heard her mother's voice rise above the others, sharp with satisfaction. The Duke danced with Lucinda twice. Mark my words, girls, this family's fortunes are about to change. Alara closed her eyes and pressed her cheek against the cool pillow, telling herself, as she always did, that none of it concerned her. She could not have known, lying there in the dark of her small room while the rest of the house celebrated a future that excluded her entirely, that fate had already begun to write a very different story. One that would begin the very next morning, in the most unexpected way imaginable, and would change the course of her life forever. The next morning arrived gray and rain-soaked, the kind of London weather that made the whole city feel muffled and slow. Alara rose early out of habit, long before the rest of the household stirred, and made her way to the small garden behind the townhouse, where she often found a few minutes of peace before the day's indignities began. The garden was little more than a modest square of gravel paths and struggling rose bushes, hemmed in by tall brick walls, but it was hers in a way nothing else in the house was. No one else bothered with it. No one else cared enough to notice when the roses needed pruning or when the gravel needed raking after a storm. She knelt beside the largest bush, examining a cluster of buds that the previous night's rain had battered nearly flat, and began carefully straightening the stems with gentle, practiced hands. She did not hear the carriage arrive at the front of the house. She did not hear the knock at the door, or the flurry of activity that followed as her mother, still in her dressing gown, rushed to receive an unexpected and entirely unannounced caller. She only realized something was wrong when Bridget came running down the garden path, her cap askew, her face pale with panic. "Miss Alara, you must come inside at once." "Whatever is the matter?" "The Duke," Bridget said, breathless. "The Duke of Ashcombe is here. He's asking for you." Alara stood so quickly she nearly knocked over the small basket of clippings beside her. "That cannot be right. He must be asking for Lucinda." "No, miss, I heard it myself. He asked for you by name." "Alara Whitmore," he said, plain as anything, "and your mother nearly fainted where she stood." Alara looked down at herself, her plain work dress smudged with garden soil, her hair coming loose from its pins, her hands still dirty from the roses, and felt a wave of panic rise in her throat. There was no time to change, no time to prepare, no time to do anything but follow Bridget back into the house on legs that did not quite feel steady beneath her. The scene in the drawing room stopped her cold the moment she stepped through the door. Her mother stood frozen near the fireplace, her face a mask of confusion and barely concealed fury. Lucinda hovered nearby in a state of visible distress, still in her mourning wrapper, clearly having been dragged from her bed the moment the caller's identity became known. And in the center of the room, tall and unmoving, dressed in a dark coat that seemed to absorb the gray morning light rather than reflect it, stood a man Alara had never seen before in her life. The Duke of Ashcombe was younger than she had expected, though every line of his face suggested a man who had aged beyond his years through some private grief. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair swept back from a face that might have been handsome if it were not so utterly still, so carefully composed, as though he had trained every muscle to reveal nothing at all. His eyes, a pale gray that reminded Alara uncomfortably of storm clouds, moved to her the moment she entered the room, and something in his expression shifted, so slight, so fleeting, that she almost believed she had imagined it. "You are Alara Whitmore," he said. It was not a question. "I am, Your Grace." She managed a small curtsy despite the mud still clinging to her hem, despite her mother's mortified expression burning into the side of her face. "I apologize for the early hour and the lack of proper notice," the Duke said, his voice low and measured, carrying none of the warmth expected of polite conversation, yet none of the cruelty rumor had assigned to him either. "I had business in this part of town, and found myself wishing to make your acquaintance directly, rather than through the usual formalities of the season." Lady Margaret found her voice at last, stepping forward with the brittle smile she reserved for important company. "Your Grace, I fear there has been some confusion. My eldest daughter Lucinda is the one who had the pleasure of your company last evening. Alara rarely attends social functions. She is not." "I am aware of who attended last evening," the Duke interrupted, not unkindly, but with a finality that closed the subject entirely. "I am equally aware that Miss Alara Whitmore did not, despite my explicit instruction that all eligible daughters of this household be presented." The room fell utterly silent. Alara watched her mother's composure crack, for just a moment before being hastily reassembled. "A misunderstanding, Your Grace, nothing more," Lady Margaret said quickly. "I assure you, had I known—" "I did not come here this morning to discuss misunderstandings, Lady Margaret." The Duke's gray eyes remained fixed on Alara, steady and unreadable. "I came because I make it a habit of forming my own judgments rather than relying on the judgments of others, and I found myself curious about the daughter your household seemed so determined I should never meet." Alara felt heat rise in her cheeks, part embarrassment, part something else entirely, something dangerously close to hope, which she immediately tried to smother before it could take root. This man knew nothing of her. He could not possibly understand what those words meant, standing there in her mother's drawing room, unraveling in a single sentence the careful erasure that had defined her entire existence within these walls. "I am afraid I am not dressed to receive callers, Your Grace," Alara said quietly, glancing down at her soiled dress, desperate for some small measure of control over a situation that had spiraled entirely beyond her understanding. For the first time, something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched the corner of the Duke's mouth. There, and gone so quickly she almost doubted she had seen it at all. I have found, Miss Whitmore, that a person's true character is often most visible in the moments they least expect to be observed. I would rather meet you exactly as you are than as you might have been arranged to appear. Lucinda made a small, wounded sound from across the room, clearly stung by the implied comparison, but the Duke did not so much as glance her way. His attention remained entirely, unnervingly fixed on Alara. "I wonder," he continued, "whether you might walk with me in your garden for a few minutes. I noticed it from the window as I arrived. Roses, I believe, though the rain has not been kind to them this season." It was such an ordinary request, and yet it landed in the room like a thunderclap. Lady Margaret opened her mouth as though to object, then closed it again, clearly recognizing that refusing a duke's request, however unusual, was not a battle she could win without consequences far worse than her daughter's muddy hem. "Of course, Your Grace," Alara said before her mother could recover enough to intervene. "This way." She led him back through the house, aware of every eye that followed them, every whisper that would no doubt spread through the servants' quarters within the hour and through the ton within the day. The garden felt smaller with him standing in it, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the gravel path, but he moved through it slowly, almost reverently, pausing beside the battered rose bush she had been tending when the world had interrupted her. "You care for these yourself," he observed, noting the small basket of clippings, the soil still fresh beneath her fingernails. "No one else bothers with them," Alara admitted. "I find I do not mind the quiet work. There is a kind of honesty in it. Roses do not care what is said about a person. They only care whether you tend them properly." The Duke studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes unreadable, though something in his posture seemed to ease, however slightly. "That is a rather unusual philosophy for a young lady of the ton." "I am told I am a rather unusual young lady, Your Grace," Alara said, and though she meant it lightly, a thread of old bitterness crept into her voice despite her best efforts to hide it. "So I have gathered," the Duke said quietly. "Though I confess, everything I have observed this morning suggests the opposite of what I was led to believe before I arrived." Alara's breath caught. She did not know what to say to that, did not trust herself to respond without revealing far more than she intended. Instead, she busied her hands with the roses again, snipping away a damaged stem with more focus than the task strictly required. The Duke did not press her further. He simply stood beside her in the gray morning light, watching the careful, patient work of her hands, and for reasons she could not begin to explain, Alara found that his silence felt nothing at all like the silences she was used to. It did not feel like erasure. It felt strangely, almost like being seen. Neither of them could have known, standing together in that small, neglected garden while rain clouds gathered once more overhead, that this quiet, unremarkable morning would soon be spoken of across every drawing-room in London, nor that the choice the Duke was about to make would upend the Whitmore household entirely, and change the shape of Alara's future in ways neither of them yet understood. 3 days after the Duke of Ashcombe walked through the Whitmore garden, a letter arrived that turned the entire household upside down. Alara was in the small sitting room mending a torn hem when she heard her mother's cry of shock echo down the hallway. She rose quickly, half expecting some disaster, only to find Lady Margaret standing in the front hall clutching a cream envelope stamped with the same severe black crest Alara had seen once before, on the letter she should never have opened. "He has requested a formal meeting with your father," Lady Margaret said, her voice unsteady in a way Alara had rarely heard. "Regarding you, Alara, he has asked for your hand." The words did not land properly at first. Alara stood very still, waiting for the sentence to rearrange itself into something that made sense, something where the Duke of Ashcombe was asking for Lucinda after all, or Rosalind, or anyone, but the daughter her family had spent 6 years trying to hide. "That cannot be right," Alara said quietly. "It is written plainly enough," her mother snapped, though the anger in her voice seemed aimed less at Alara and more at the impossible situation itself. "Your father is with him now in the study. He asked to speak with him alone." Alara's stomach twisted into a knot of confusion, and something else she refused to name. She thought of the quiet garden, the Duke's unreadable gray eyes, the strange stillness of his presence beside her among the roses. She had told herself in the days since that the encounter had meant nothing, that a powerful man's momentary curiosity about an overlooked daughter was hardly the foundation for anything real. She had not allowed herself to hope. And yet here was her mother, pale and trembling, holding proof that hope had arrived regardless of her permission. "Does father know why?" Alara asked. "Why me and not?" "I have no idea why," Lady Margaret said sharply, "and frankly, I do not care to examine a duke's reasoning too closely when it delivers such fortune to this family. You will go upstairs and prepare yourself properly. Whatever foolishness led him to this decision, we will not risk losing it through carelessness." The sudden shift in her mother's tone, from fury to calculation in the span of a single breath, struck Alara harder than any insult ever had. 6 years of being told she was unworthy, unwanted, a stain upon the family name, and now, faced with the possibility of a duke's fortune and title, her mother's disdain evaporated as though it had never existed at all. It was not affection that softened Lady Margaret's expression. It was ambition. Alara climbed the stairs slowly, her mind spinning with questions that had no easy answers. She passed Lucinda's door, slightly ajar, and heard her elder sister's muffled weeping within. A part of her wanted to go in, to offer some comfort, to explain that she had not sought this, had not schemed for it, had done nothing but tend roses in a muddy dress on an ordinary morning. But she suspected Lucinda would not believe her, not now, not with a duke's proposal hanging in the air like a verdict none of them had expected. She reached her own small room and sat by the window, watching the street below where the duke's dark carriage still waited, its polished lanterns gleaming despite the overcast sky. Somewhere beneath her, in her father's study, her entire future was being decided by 2 men who had not thought to ask her opinion on the matter at all. It was nearly an hour before she was finally summoned. The study smelled of pipe smoke and old leather, the familiar scent of her father's private domain, a room Alara had rarely been permitted to enter growing up. Lord Edmund Whitmore sat behind his desk, his expression a careful blend of astonishment and calculation that mirrored his wife's precisely. The Duke stood near the window, his tall frame silhouetted against the gray afternoon light, his expression as composed and unreadable as it had been in the garden days before. "Alara," her father said, his voice oddly formal, as though addressing a stranger rather than his own daughter. "His Grace has made a proposal of marriage. I have given my consent, pending your own agreement, of course." Of course, as though her agreement had ever mattered to anyone in this house before now. She looked at the Duke, searching his still, composed face for some clue as to what had brought him to this decision, some explanation for why a man who could have any woman in London had chosen the one his own family had spent years trying to erase. "May I speak with His Grace alone for a moment?" Alara asked, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. Her father hesitated, glancing toward the Duke as though seeking permission for a request made in his own house, which told Alara everything she needed to know about the true balance of power now settling over the Whitmore family. "Of course," the Duke said simply, "if Miss Whitmore wishes it." Lord Edmund excused himself with visible reluctance, closing the study door behind him, leaving Alara alone with the man who had, in the span of a single conversation, appended 6 years of carefully constructed misery. "Why me?" she asked the moment the door clicked shut. There was no point in polite pretense, not when so much depended on an honest answer. "You do not know me, Your Grace. We spoke for perhaps 20 minutes among my roses." "That is hardly grounds for marriage." The Duke regarded her steadily, and for a long moment she thought he might simply refuse to answer at all. Then he spoke, his voice low and careful, as though weighing each word before releasing it. "I have spent 2 years watching London's most eligible young ladies parade themselves before me with practiced smiles and rehearsed conversation, each one certain that flattery would secure my title, he said. I have grown deeply tired of performances, Miss Whitmore. What I witnessed in your garden was not a performance. It was simply you, unguarded, tending roses because you found honesty in the work. I have not encountered honesty of that kind in a very long time. Alara felt something tighten in her chest, some mixture of disbelief and a longing she had not allowed herself to feel in years. That seems a rather thin foundation for a marriage that will bind us both for the rest of our lives. Perhaps, the Duke acknowledged. I will not pretend this is a romantic proposal, Miss Whitmore. I require an heir, and I have exhausted my patience with the usual methods of finding a suitable duchess. I believe you and I could build something honest between us, whatever else it may lack in the beginning. I am not asking you to love me. I am asking whether you would consider a partnership built on mutual respect, rather than pretense. It was, Alara thought, perhaps the strangest proposal any woman in London had ever received, cold in its practicality, and yet somehow more honest than any warm words her family had ever offered her. There was no cruelty in his tone, no hidden mockery waiting to be sprung. Only a plain, unvarnished truth, offered without apology. And if I refuse? She asked quietly, needing to know that the choice was truly hers, not simply another decision made on her behalf by people who had never bothered to ask her opinion before. Then I will withdraw my request and trouble your family no further, the Duke said without hesitation. I would not have a wife who felt herself trapped into the arrangement. That serves neither of us. Alara studied his face for a long moment, searching for any trace of deception, any hint of the cold cruelty rumor had assigned to him. She found none. What she found instead was a kind of weary honesty she recognized in herself, the particular exhaustion of a person who had learned, through hard experience, to expect very little kindness from the world, and had stopped pretending otherwise. My family will make this arrangement sound like a fairy tale to anyone who will listen, she said. They will forget, quite conveniently, that they tried to hide me from you entirely. I want you to understand, before you commit yourself to this, that I come with no dowry worth mentioning, no reputation worth protecting, and a family who will very likely attempt to use this marriage for their own advantage at every opportunity. Something shifted in the Duke's expression then, subtle but unmistakable, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it, a flicker of genuine interest breaking through his careful composure. You speak of your own family's failings more honestly than most young ladies speak of their virtues. I find that rather reassuring, Miss Whitmore. You may not find it so reassuring once you have lived among them for a season, Alara said dryly, and this time the corner of the Duke's mouth did lift, ever so slightly, into something that might genuinely have been called a smile. I am accustomed to difficult family dynamics, he said, and something dark passed briefly behind his gray eyes, gone before she could examine it closely. I do not expect yours to trouble me unduly. Alara took a slow breath, weighing the strange, unexpected shape of the choice before her. Marriage to a man she barely knew, a man whose reputation painted him as cold and unreachable, yet who stood before her now offering something no one else in her life ever had, the simple dignity of being asked, rather than told, what she wanted. I accept your grace, she said finally, on the condition that whatever we build between us, it is built honestly. I have had enough of pretense to last several lifetimes. Agreed, the Duke said and extended his hand, not for a kiss as courtship traditions demanded, but simply to shake, as though sealing a business arrangement between two equals. Alara took it without hesitation and found his grip firm, steady, and entirely without pretense, exactly as promised. The engagement was announced within the week, and London erupted into the particular frenzy reserved for scandals too delicious to ignore. Alara Whitmore, the family's quiet disgrace, the daughter no one had bothered introducing at balls for 6 long years, was to become the next Duchess of Ashcombe. The gossip columns speculated wildly about what dark bargain must have secured such an unlikely match. Some claimed the Duke had lost a wager. Others whispered that Alara had trapped him through some scheme too scandalous to print. A few, Kinder souls suggested that perhaps the Duke simply saw something in her that others had missed, though these voices were far outnumbered by the cruel and curious. Elara bore it all with a composure that surprised even herself. She had spent 6 years learning to withstand whispers, and found that the whispers of envy stung far less than the whispers of contempt she had grown accustomed to. Her mother, meanwhile, transformed almost overnight into Elara's most devoted champion, showering her with a warmth so sudden and so clearly self-serving that Elara could not help but feel a bitter kind of vindication watching it unfold. "You must wear the sapphires to the engagement ball," Lady Margaret insisted one afternoon, holding up a necklace Elara had never once been permitted to touch in 6 years of living beneath the same roof. "They will suit you beautifully, my dear." "My dear." Elara nearly laughed aloud at the phrase, spoken so easily now, as though 6 years of being called nothing more affectionate than the shame of this house had simply never occurred. "Thank you, mother," Elara said instead, accepting the necklace with a politeness that cost her more effort than her mother would ever understand. She had promised herself, in the quiet privacy of her own thoughts, that she would not allow bitterness to poison whatever strange, fragile future now lay ahead of her. But she would also not forget. Forgetting, she had learned long ago, was simply another word for permission, and she had given her family quite enough of that already. The engagement ball itself was a spectacle unlike anything the Whitmore household had ever hosted, funded quietly and without fanfare by the Duke himself, who seemed entirely unconcerned with the family's more modest means. Elara stood at the top of the grand staircase in a gown of deep silver silk, the sapphires cold against her collarbone, watching the same ton that had once looked past her now craning their necks for a glimpse of the woman who had somehow captured the elusive Duke of Ashcombe. She found him waiting at the bottom of the stairs, dressed in formal black, his expression composed as always, though something in his gray eyes softened slightly as she descended toward him. "You look as though you would rather be anywhere else," he observed quietly, offering his arm as she reached the final step. "I have never been particularly fond of crowds who spent years pretending I did not exist," Elara admitted, taking his arm despite the trembling she hoped he could not feel through her gloves. "Forgive me if I do not share their enthusiasm tonight." "There is nothing to forgive," the Duke said, and led her onto the ballroom floor as every eye in the room turned to watch, as the orchestra began the opening strains of the first dance, as 6 years of erasure dissolved beneath the weight of a single, undeniable truth, that the family's greatest shame now stood at the center of every conversation in London, chosen, deliberately and without apology, by the one man no one had ever expected to choose her at all. Yet even as the music swelled and the candles glittered overhead, Elara could not shake a quiet unease settling beneath her composed smile. She had agreed to build something honest with this cold, careful stranger who now held her gloved hand in his. But honesty, she knew better than most, was a fragile thing, easily corrupted by the ambitions of a family who had already begun whispering about the advantages this marriage might bring them, and by secrets neither she nor the Duke had yet found the courage to share. The morning of the wedding arrived with a cold, sharp wind that rattled the windows of the Whitmore townhouse, and Elara woke long before dawn with her heart pounding, as though she were facing a battle rather than a marriage. She lay still for several minutes, staring at the ceiling of the small room she had occupied for 6 years, trying to memorize its familiar cracks and shadows one final time. By evening she would sleep beneath an entirely different roof, in an entirely different life, bound to a man she had known for scarcely 3 weeks. The thought did not frighten her nearly as much as she expected it to. What frightened her far more was the small, stubborn hope she could not quite extinguish, the quiet wish that this strange, practical arrangement might somehow become something more than either of them had bargained for. Bridget arrived just after dawn to help her dress, her eyes bright with an excitement Elara found herself unable to fully share. "You'll be a duchess by noon, miss. Can you imagine it? After everything this family put you through." "I would rather not think of it as revenge," Elara said quietly, watching her reflection in the small mirror as Bridget worked pins into her hair. "Though I confess there is a certain satisfaction in it." "There's nothing wrong with a bit of satisfaction," Bridget said firmly, tying off the final pin. "You've earned every bit of it and more besides." The wedding gown, commissioned hastily but expertly by the Duke's own household seamstress, fit Alara as though it had been made for a different woman entirely. A woman confident in her place in the world, unashamed of the space she occupied. She stared at her reflection for a long moment, hardly recognizing the composed, elegant figure staring back at her, and wondered whether the woman in the mirror might eventually become real, or whether she would always feel, underneath the silk and lace, like the frightened girl kneeling to gather broken porcelain from a marble floor. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of candlelight and unfamiliar faces, the small church crowded with members of the ton eager to witness the union everyone still whispered about. Alara walked down the aisle on her father's arm, aware of every eye upon her, aware too of the Duke waiting at the altar, his tall figure composed and still as always, though his gray eyes followed her every step with an intensity that made her breath catch despite herself. They exchanged vows in low, steady voices, promising devotion neither of them had yet earned from the other, and when the Duke slipped a heavy gold ring onto her finger, his hands were surprisingly warm against her cold skin, a small, unexpected detail that lodged itself in Alara's memory long after the ceremony ended. The wedding breakfast that followed was a grander affair than anything the Whitmore household had ever hosted, held at the Duke's own townhouse in Mayfair, its halls decorated with fresh flowers and gleaming silver that spoke of a wealth far beyond anything Alara had grown up with. Her mother moved through the crowd with barely concealed glee, accepting congratulations as though the marriage had been entirely her own doing, while Lucinda maintained a strained, brittle smile that fooled no one who looked closely enough. Alara found herself seated beside the Duke at the head table, watching the celebration unfold around her with a curious sense of detachment, as though observing someone else's life through a pane of glass. It was only when the Duke leaned slightly toward her, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear, that the detachment finally cracked. "You look as though you are attending a stranger's celebration rather than your own," he observed. "Perhaps I am," Alara admitted quietly. "I have spent so many years standing at the edges of rooms like this one, watching my family celebrate without me, that I hardly know how to occupy the center of attention instead." The Duke considered this for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Then perhaps we shall have to learn together. I confess I have spent the past 2 years avoiding rooms exactly like this one, for reasons of my own." "Because of your late wife," Alara said gently, watching carefully for his reaction, uncertain whether the subject was permitted between them yet. Something shadowed passed across his features, brief but unmistakable, before he composed himself once more. "Among other reasons, yes. I do not speak of her often. I hope that will not trouble you." "It will not," Alara said honestly. "I understand better than most what it means to carry grief quietly, out of sight of a world that would rather not be troubled by it." The Duke studied her for a long moment, and something in his careful composure eased slightly, as though her words had confirmed some private hope he had not dared voice aloud. "I am beginning to think, Duchess, that I have made a wiser choice than even I understood at the time." It was the first time he had called her by her new title, and something warm bloomed unexpectedly in Alara's chest at the sound of it, spoken not with mockery or condescension, as her family's compliments so often were, but with a quiet, genuine respect that felt entirely foreign and entirely welcome. They departed for Ashcombe House, the Duke's principal estate 2 hours outside London, as the afternoon light began to fade into evening. The carriage ride passed largely in silence, though it was not an uncomfortable silence, Alara noted with some surprise, simply the quiet of 2 people still learning the shape of each other's company. Ashcombe House itself rose from the surrounding parkland like something from a half-remembered dream, its gray stone facade softened by ivy and framed by ancient oak trees that had clearly stood sentinel over the property for centuries. Alara stepped down from the carriage and stood for a long moment, simply looking up at the imposing structure that would now be her home, feeling the full weight of how dramatically her circumstances had shifted in the span of a single day. "It is rather large," the Duke said, watching her reaction with something like amusement. "I am told it can feel overwhelming at first. You will find your own corners of it soon enough, I imagine." "I am rather good at finding quiet corners," Alara said, thinking of the neglected rose garden that had first brought them together. "I do not imagine that skill will fail me here." The housekeeper, a stern but not unkind woman named Mrs. Fenwick, greeted them at the entrance and led Alara on a brief tour of the ground floor before showing her to the Duchess's private chambers, a suite of rooms grander than anything Alara had ever occupied in her life. She stood in the center of the sitting room long after Mrs. Fenwick had departed, running her fingers over the fine furnishings, the silk draperies, the shelves of books she had never been permitted to touch in her father's house, and felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes. It was not sadness, exactly. It was something closer to disbelief, the strange vertigo of finally receiving what she had never allowed herself to want. Dinner that evening was a quiet, formal affair, the two of them seated at opposite ends of a long table that seemed to emphasize rather than diminish the distance still remaining between them. The Duke spoke little, though Alara noticed he watched her carefully throughout the meal, his gray eyes tracking her expressions with the same quiet attentiveness he had shown in the garden weeks before. "You need not eat in silence on my account," Alara said finally, unable to bear the weight of the quiet any longer. "I confess I would welcome conversation if you are willing to offer it." The Duke set down his fork, considering her request with evident seriousness. "I am told I am not particularly skilled at conversation. My staff would likely describe me as difficult company." "Your staff have not seen you kneeling in a muddy garden, discussing roses with more patience than most men show their own children," Alara said, and was rewarded with the faint, genuine smile she had come to recognize as rare and precious in equal measure. "Perhaps I reserve my patience for subjects that deserve it," he said quietly, and something in his tone suggested the words carried more weight than their surface meaning implied. They spoke for nearly an hour after that, tentative at first, then with growing ease, touching on subjects both trivial and meaningful. Her fondness for gardening, his interest in architecture, the particular loneliness of growing up in households that valued appearance over substance. Alara found herself, quite unexpectedly, enjoying his company far more than she had anticipated, drawn in by the careful, deliberate way he chose his words, the flashes of dry humor that occasionally broke through his composed exterior. It was only when their conversation turned, inevitably, toward the subject of their families that the evening's warmth began to cool. "Your mother seemed rather pleased with this arrangement," the Duke observed carefully, watching Alara's reaction with the same attentiveness he brought to every observation. "My mother is pleased with the arrangement's advantages," Alara said, unable to fully mask the bitterness that crept into her voice. "I do not believe her feelings toward me have changed nearly so much as her behavior suggests." "And your feelings toward her?" Alara considered the question carefully, aware that her answer revealed more of herself than perhaps she intended. "I have spent 6 years learning not to expect warmth from that quarter. I do not intend to lower my guard now, simply because circumstances have shifted in my favor." The Duke nodded slowly, something like understanding passing across his features. "A wise policy. I confess I have adopted a similar one with regard to my own family, though for rather different reasons." "You have family beyond your late wife's memory?" Alara asked gently, sensing she had stumbled onto territory the Duke rarely discussed. "A sister," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Lady Charlotte. We are not close, though not through any fault of hers. Our father was not a kind man, and the wounds of that particular household have proven slow to heal for both of us." Alara felt a small, unexpected kinship bloom at his words, a recognition of shared experience that no amount of careful courtship conversation could have manufactured. "Then, perhaps, we understand each other better than either of us anticipated when we agreed to this marriage." "Perhaps we do," the Duke agreed, and for the first time since their strange, practical courtship had begun, Alara allowed herself to believe, however cautiously, that something genuine might yet grow between them. The days that followed settled into a quiet, careful rhythm. Alara explored the vast grounds of Ashcombe House each morning, discovering neglected gardens that she immediately claimed as her own personal project, much to Mrs. Fenwick's evident approval. The Duke, whom she gradually learned to call Alistair in private moments, spent his mornings managing estate business, but made a habit of joining her for tea each afternoon, their conversations growing steadily more comfortable, more honest, with each passing day. She learned that his coldness, so widely discussed throughout London, was less a matter of genuine indifference and more a carefully constructed shield, built over years of loss and betrayal that he revealed to her only in careful, measured fragments. His young wife, she learned, had died not of illness as most believed, but in circumstances the Duke clearly still found difficult to discuss. A carriage accident on a road she should never have been traveling alone, under circumstances that suggested she had been fleeing something, or someone, though the Duke refused to elaborate further, and Alara did not press him. In turn, she found herself sharing pieces of her own history she had never spoken aloud to anyone, not even Bridget, who had witnessed most of it firsthand. She told him of the lie that had destroyed her reputation at 16, of her cousin Gideon's cowardice, of the slow, grinding erosion of her family's affection in the years that followed. The Duke listened without interruption, his expression carefully controlled, though something dark and dangerous flickered behind his gray eyes when she described the particular cruelty of her mother's treatment. "Your cousin," he said finally, his voice low and controlled in a way that suggested considerable effort. "Gideon Whitmore, is he still received in society?" "He married well 2 years ago," Alara said, watching the Duke's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "No one remembers the particulars of what happened, only that I was somehow involved in scandal and he was not." "That will not remain the case indefinitely," the Duke said, and something in his tone carried a quiet, controlled promise that made Alara's breath catch. "I do not make threats lightly, Alara, and I do not intend to make one now. But I have resources your family does not, and I have never been particularly forgiving of cowardice dressed up as respectability." "You need not fight my battles for me," Alara said, though something warm and unfamiliar stirred in her chest at the fierce protectiveness in his voice. "I have fought them alone for 6 years. I have grown rather accustomed to it." "You need not fight them alone any longer," the Duke said simply, and the quiet certainty in his voice settled something restless deep within her. A wound she had not realized was still so raw until his words began, carefully and deliberately, to close it. Their wedding night, when it finally came, was tender in a way neither of them had quite expected from an arrangement built on such practical foundations. Alara found herself surprised by the gentleness beneath the Duke's carefully controlled exterior, the patience he showed in every small moment, the quiet reverence with which he treated her, as though she were something precious rather than something acquired through convenient circumstance. Afterward, lying in the vast, unfamiliar bed with the Duke's steady breathing beside her, Alara allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to imagine a future built not on mere survival, but on something that might genuinely resemble happiness. She did not yet know that her family's ambitions, dormant for only a matter of weeks, had already begun stirring once more in London, nor that the secrets buried in the Duke's own painful history were far from fully settled. But for that one quiet night, wrapped in the fragile warmth of a beginning neither of them had anticipated, Alara allowed herself simply to rest, to breathe, and to hope, however cautiously, that the family's greatest shame might yet become someone entirely new. The letter arrived 3 weeks into the marriage, and Alara knew from the particular slant of her mother's handwriting on the envelope that peace was about to be shattered. She was in the small library at Ashcombe House, curled into a window seat with a book of poetry she had discovered among the Duke's extensive collection, when Mrs. Fenwick delivered the post on a silver tray. Alara set the book aside and opened her mother's letter with a cautious hand, already bracing herself for whatever request lay folded within the elegant script. She was not disappointed in her low expectations. "My dearest Alara," the letter began, a phrase so foreign to 6 years of experience that Alara nearly laughed aloud despite the growing unease in her stomach. Your father and I have been discussing the matter of Rosalind's upcoming season, and given your fortunate new position, we wondered whether His Grace might be persuaded to sponsor a small townhouse for the family closer to the fashionable districts. Our current situation, while adequate, does not reflect our family's new standing, and it would be a shame for Rosalind's prospects to suffer for want of proper address. Alara read the request twice, feeling something cold and familiar settle over her, the particular disappointment of discovering that even now, even after everything, her family's affection remained precisely as conditional as it had always been. She had allowed herself, in the quiet happiness of the past 3 weeks, to half believe that perhaps something had genuinely shifted in her mother's regard for her. This letter made abundantly clear that nothing had changed at all. She had simply become useful in a new and more profitable way. She found the Duke in his study that evening, reviewing estate ledgers by lamplight, and set her mother's letter on the desk before him without preamble. "My family would like you to purchase them a townhouse," she said flatly, "for Rosalind's season." The Duke read the letter slowly, his expression giving away nothing, though Alara noticed the faint tightening at the corner of his jaw that she had learned, over these past weeks, indicated genuine displeasure carefully suppressed. "Would you like me to grant this request?" he asked finally, setting the letter aside. "I would like you to do whatever you believe is wise," Alara said carefully, "though I confess I do not wish to see you taken advantage of on my account." "You are not the one taking advantage of me, Alara," the Duke said, his voice gentle but firm, "and I do not intend to allow your family to mistake generosity for weakness. However," he paused, considering, "I do not wish to see Rosalind suffer for her mother's ambitions. She is, from what you have described, largely innocent in this particular pattern of behavior." "She is," Alara admitted. "Rosalind was young when the scandal happened. She has always been kinder to me than the rest of the family, in her own quiet way." "Then perhaps a compromise," the Duke suggested. "I will provide a modest allowance to support Rosalind's season specifically, arranged through a solicitor rather than granted directly to your parents. It will be enough to ensure she is properly presented, without handing your mother the unlimited resources she clearly hopes to acquire." Alara felt a wave of gratitude wash over her, not merely for the practical solution, but for the careful, deliberate way the Duke had listened to the nuances of her family's dynamics, and responded with genuine thoughtfulness rather than simple dismissal. "Thank you, Alistair. That is more than fair." "You need not thank me for refusing to be manipulated," the Duke said dryly, though something warm lingered beneath the dry humor. "I have had considerable practice avoiding manipulation throughout my life. It is one of the few skills my difficult upbringing gifted me." Alara smiled, settling into the chair across from his desk, grateful beyond words for a partner who met her family's demands with clear eyes rather than blind generosity. In the weeks that followed, this pattern repeated itself with increasing frequency. A request for funds here, a suggestion that the Duke might use his influence to secure some social advantage there, each one couched in increasingly affectionate language that fooled neither Alara nor her husband. Lucinda's letters, when they arrived, carried a different tone entirely, thinly veiled resentment dressed up as sisterly concern, questions about whether Alara found her new position difficult to manage, whether the Duke's coldness had proven as challenging as rumor suggested, transparent attempts to discover some crack in the marriage that Lucinda could privately celebrate. Alara answered these letters politely, but briefly, refusing to give her sister the satisfaction of any confession, real or imagined. It was Gideon's letter, arriving unexpectedly in the 6th week of the marriage, that finally tested the fragile peace Alara had begun to build. She recognized her cousin's handwriting immediately, and felt her stomach drop before she had even broken the seal. Gideon Whitmore had not written to her once in the 6 years, since his lie had destroyed her reputation, and she could think of no reason for him to begin now, except some fresh scheme designed for his own benefit. "Dear cousin," the letter read, "I write to offer my sincerest congratulations on your marriage, and to express my hope that whatever unpleasantness passed between our families in years prior might now be set aside, given your fortunate new circumstances. I find myself in need of a modest loan to settle certain business obligations, and I trust that a woman of your generous nature, now blessed with considerable resources, would not begrudge family in a moment of genuine need. Alara set the letter down with hands that trembled, not from sadness this time, but from a cold, clarifying fury she had rarely allowed herself to feel in 6 years of careful self-restraint. The audacity of it, the sheer, breathtaking arrogance of a man who had destroyed her reputation through cowardly lies, now writing to request money as though nothing had ever happened between them, struck her with a force that left her momentarily unable to breathe properly. She found the Duke in the gardens, examining the progress of the rose beds Alara had spent weeks restoring, and handed him the letter without a word. He read it in silence, and Alara watched the careful composure she had come to recognize so well slowly harden into something far more dangerous, something that reminded her, uncomfortably, of exactly why London society still whispered about the Duke of Ashcombe with such wary respect. "This is the cousin who spread the lie against you," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Alara confirmed. "I have not spoken to him in 6 years. I did not expect him to write at all, let alone request money as though we were on friendly terms." The Duke folded the letter carefully, his gray eyes cold in a way Alara had never witnessed directed at herself, though she found herself grateful in that moment that his anger burned so clearly on her behalf. "I believe it is time I paid your cousin a visit." "Alistair," Alara said carefully, placing a hand on his arm, "I do not want you to fight my battles through violence or threats. That is not the kind of justice I wish for." "I have no intention of resorting to violence," the Duke said, his voice controlled despite the anger still simmering beneath the surface. "I intend to visit your cousin and inform him, quite plainly, that any future correspondence with this household will be met with the full weight of my resources turned toward exposing precisely what he did to you 6 years ago. Cowards like your cousin rely on the assumption that no one will ever bother uncovering their lies. I intend to disabuse him of that particular comfort." Alara studied her husband's face for a long moment, moved beyond words by the fierce, quiet protectiveness radiating from every carefully controlled line of his expression. "You would do that for me?" "I would do considerably more than that for you," the Duke said, his voice softening slightly as he reached up to gently brush a loose strand of hair from her face, a small, tender gesture that had become increasingly familiar between them over the past weeks. "You have spent 6 years carrying the weight of another person's cowardice. I do not intend to let that continue simply because addressing it might prove uncomfortable for your family." 2 days later, the Duke departed for a private meeting with Gideon Whitmore, refusing to disclose the precise details of what transpired, though Alara noticed, in the weeks that followed, that no further correspondence arrived from her cousin, and that certain quiet rumors began circulating through London regarding the true circumstances of a scandal from 6 years prior. Rumors that, for the first time, painted Alara not as the villain of the story, but as its wronged and long-suffering victim. She never learned precisely what the Duke had said to secure this shift in public perception, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not particularly wish to know. It was enough to feel the slow, gradual lifting of a weight she had carried for so long that she had nearly forgotten what its absence might feel like. Her relationship with the Duke deepened steadily through these small, significant moments. His quiet defense of her against her family's continued demands, his patient willingness to listen as she slowly unpacked years of accumulated hurt, his own tentative openness in sharing pieces of his past that he had clearly shared with no one else since his first wife's death. It was during one such evening, several weeks later, sitting together beside the fire in the private drawing room they had begun to favor for their evening conversations, that the Duke finally spoke more openly than he ever had before about the wife he had lost. "Her name was Margaret," he said quietly, staring into the flickering flames rather than meeting Alara's eyes. "She was young when we married, barely 18, and I was perhaps too focused on securing an appropriate match to notice how unhappy she truly was in our arrangement. Alara said nothing, sensing that the Duke needed space to continue at his own pace, that any interruption might close a door he had rarely, if ever, opened before. She had feelings for another man before our marriage was arranged, the Duke continued, his voice carefully controlled. I did not learn this until much later, when it was already far too late to matter. She was fleeing to meet him, the night of the accident, having finally found the courage to leave a marriage that had made her deeply unhappy. I have carried considerable guilt over the years, wondering whether a warmer husband, a more attentive one, might have prevented her from feeling so trapped that flight seemed her only option. "Alistair," Alara said softly, moving closer to take his hand in hers. "You cannot hold yourself responsible for choices that were never entirely within your control." "Perhaps not," the Duke acknowledged, though his voice carried little conviction. "But it is difficult to release guilt that has shaped so much of who I have become. I built walls after her death, Alara, walls I told myself protected me from ever causing that kind of unhappiness again. I am only now beginning to understand that those same walls very nearly cost me the chance to know you at all." Alara felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, moved by the raw honesty in his voice, by the trust implicit in sharing something he had clearly guarded so carefully for so long. "I am grateful those walls did not succeed in keeping me out." "As am I," the Duke said, turning to meet her eyes fully for the first time since he had begun speaking, his gray gaze warm now in a way that no longer reminded her of storm clouds, but of something gentler, something that felt unmistakably like the early beginnings of genuine love. "I did not expect to feel this way again, Alara. I want you to know that whatever practical foundation this marriage began upon, my feelings for you have grown into something far beyond mere practicality." "Mine as well," Alara admitted quietly, her heart swelling with an emotion she had not allowed herself to name until this very moment. "I did not expect to find happiness in this marriage, Alistair. I certainly did not expect to find you." They sat together by the fire long into the evening, the careful distance that had once defined their arrangement dissolving into something warmer, something that felt increasingly, unmistakably, like the foundation of genuine love rather than mere convenient partnership. For the first time since her family's cruelty had taught her to expect so little from the world, Alara allowed herself to believe, fully and without reservation, that she had found something real. She did not yet know that her family's schemes had grown far more dangerous than a simple request for money, nor that a secret from the Duke's own painful past was about to resurface in a way that would test the fragile trust they had so carefully built between them. The knock at the door came just after midnight, urgent and insistent, dragging Alara from a peaceful sleep beside her husband. She sat up quickly, her heart pounding, aware of the Duke stirring beside her with the same alertness that years of managing a great estate had trained into him. "Who would call at this hour?" she whispered, already reaching for her dressing gown. They found Mrs. Fenwick in the entrance hall, her face pale in the candlelight, standing before a disheveled figure Alara recognized with a sinking dread as Rosalind, her younger sister, her traveling cloak soaked through with rain, her eyes red from crying. "Rosalind," Alara said, rushing forward, "what has happened? Are you hurt?" Her sister collapsed into her arms, sobbing too hard to speak coherently for several long minutes, while the Duke quietly instructed Mrs. Fenwick to bring warm blankets and tea, his own expression carefully composed despite the obvious concern in his gray eyes. "Father has ruined us," Rosalind finally managed, once she had been settled by the fire in the private drawing room, wrapped in a warm blanket, a cup of untouched tea trembling in her hands. "He made terrible investments, Alara, based on promises from men who turned out to be swindlers. We have lost nearly everything. The bank is threatening to seize the townhouse itself." Alara felt her stomach drop, a familiar cold dread settling over her despite the warmth of the fire nearby. "How is that possible? Father has always been careful with money, whatever his other failings." "He grew reckless after your marriage," Rosalind said miserably. He believed your connection to His grace would protect the family from any consequences, no matter how foolish his decisions became. He invested heavily in a shipping venture that promised extraordinary returns, using nearly everything we had as collateral. The ships were lost at sea 3 weeks ago. There is nothing left to recover. Alara glanced at the Duke, who had remained quiet throughout Rosalind's explanation, his expression giving away little of his private thoughts. "And Mother sent you here alone, at this hour in this weather." "Mother does not know I have come," Rosalind admitted, a fresh wave of tears threatening to overwhelm her composure once more. "She and Father have been arguing for days about what to do, and I could not bear to remain in that house any longer, listening to them blame each other while our entire world collapses around us. I did not know where else to go." Alara pulled her sister close once more, feeling the familiar tangle of complicated emotions that her family always seemed to provoke, genuine sympathy for Rosalind's obvious distress, mingled with a weary recognition that whatever crisis had befallen her parents was almost certainly a consequence of their own poor choices that would now, inevitably, become Alara's problem to solve as well. "You will stay here tonight," the Duke said finally, his voice calm and decisive in a way that immediately eased some of the tension in the room. "We will discuss what can be done for your family in the morning, once everyone has had proper rest. Nothing productive comes from decisions made at midnight, in a state of exhaustion and fear." Rosalind nodded gratefully, and Mrs. Fenwick was summoned once more to prepare a guest chamber, leaving Alara and the Duke alone by the dying fire. "I am sorry," Alara said quietly, once her sister had been settled upstairs. "I did not anticipate my family's problems following us quite so directly into our home." "You need not apologize for circumstances entirely beyond your control," the Duke said gently, taking her hand in his. "Though I confess I am troubled by what this situation might mean going forward. Your father's recklessness has created a genuine crisis, and I suspect he will look to us to resolve it entirely. I do not wish for you to simply hand over funds without careful consideration," Alara said firmly. "I have watched my family exploit generosity my entire life. I will not allow you to become another casualty of their poor judgment." "Nor do I intend to be," the Duke assured her. "But I also do not wish to see Rosalind, or indeed your mother, suffer destitution for your father's mistakes, whatever grievances I might personally hold against the rest of your family." The following morning brought fresh complications when Lord Edmund Whitmore himself arrived at Ashcombe House, disheveled and visibly desperate, having tracked his daughter's flight to her sister's new home. He was received in the Duke's study, and Alara insisted on being present for the conversation, refusing to be sidelined once more from matters that so directly concerned her own family. "Your Grace," Lord Edmund began, his usual composure entirely abandoned in favor of naked desperation, "I find myself in circumstances that require your assistance. My investments have failed catastrophically, and without immediate intervention, my family will lose everything we possess. I appeal to you, as my daughter's husband, to consider the reputation of this family that now bears your connection through marriage." Alara watched her father's performance with a familiar, weary clarity, recognizing the careful calculation beneath his desperate words. The implicit suggestion that the Duke's own reputation was somehow bound to the Whitmore family's continued respectability, that refusing assistance might reflect poorly upon Ashcombe itself, rather than simply upon her father's poor judgment. "I understand your difficulty, Lord Edmund," the Duke said carefully, his tone giving away nothing of his private opinion on the matter. "But I must ask directly, what specifically are you requesting of me?" "A loan," Lord Edmund said quickly. "Sufficient to settle our most pressing debts and preserve the townhouse. I would repay it, of course, once our circumstances improve." "And how, precisely, do you intend to improve your circumstances?" the Duke asked, "given that your previous investment already demonstrated a willingness to risk everything on ventures you did not fully understand." Lord Edmund's face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and barely contained anger at being questioned so directly. Clearly unaccustomed to having his judgment challenged by anyone, least of all a son-in-law he had assumed, would simply provide whatever funds were requested without complication. "I hardly think it is your place to question my financial decisions," Lord Edmund said stiffly. "I am asking for family assistance, nothing more." "You are asking for a substantial sum of money," the Duke corrected, his voice remaining perfectly calm despite the growing tension in the room, "based on a family relationship that you yourself worked diligently to erase for 6 years, until circumstances made that erasure inconvenient to your own ambitions." The room fell into a heavy, uncomfortable silence. Alara watched her father's face cycle through several emotions: shock at being confronted so directly, anger at the accusation, and finally, a grudging recognition that his usual tactics of intimidation and guilt would not succeed against a man who had clearly already gathered every relevant fact regarding his treatment of Alara. "I will provide assistance," the Duke continued, before Lord Edmund could formulate a response, "but not in the manner you have requested. I will settle your outstanding debts directly with your creditors, ensuring the townhouse remains in your possession. However, I will not provide funds directly to you or your wife going forward. Any future financial matters concerning your household will be managed through my solicitor, with strict oversight regarding how resources are allocated. I will also require that Rosalind be permitted to remain under our protection through the completion of her season, given the obvious instability currently affecting your household." Lord Edmund's face darkened further at these conditions, clearly recognizing them for what they were: a polite but firm refusal to allow him continued unrestricted access to his daughter's newfound fortune. "This is hardly the generous family support I had hoped for." "It is considerably more generous than your treatment of my wife over the past 6 years warranted," the Duke said, his voice hardening slightly for the first time in the conversation. "I would advise you to accept these terms with gratitude, Lord Edmund, rather than complaint." "I do not offer them a second time." Alara watched her father's shoulders slump in defeat, the fight draining visibly from his posture as he recognized the futility of further argument. "Very well," he said stiffly. "I accept your terms, Your Grace, and thank you for your assistance." He departed shortly after, his composure only partially restored, leaving Alara alone with the Duke once more in the quiet aftermath of the confrontation. "Thank you," she said softly, moving to embrace him, "for protecting Rosalind and for refusing to allow my father to simply take advantage of your generosity." "I meant every word I said to him," the Duke replied, holding her close. "Your family will not use this marriage to continue treating you as though your only value lies in what you can provide them. I will not permit it." The weeks that followed brought Rosalind fully into the household at Ashcombe, and Alara found unexpected joy in her younger sister's company, free from the tensions and cruelties that had defined so much of their shared childhood. Rosalind, freed from their mother's constant, ambitious pressure, revealed herself to be genuinely kind, quick to laugh, and increasingly protective of Alara in ways their shared history had never previously allowed. "I always knew what happened with Gideon was a lie," Rosalind confessed one afternoon, as the sisters walked together through the restored rose gardens. "I was too young and too frightened of Mother to say anything at the time. I have regretted my silence every day since." "You were a child, Rosalind," Alara said gently, squeezing her sister's hand. "I do not hold you responsible for staying silent when speaking out would have brought Mother's fury down upon you as well." "I still wish I had found the courage," Rosalind said quietly. "I am glad, at least, that the truth is finally becoming known now, even if it took 6 years, and a Duke's intervention to accomplish what I should have managed myself." It was during this same period, as Alara's relationship with Rosalind deepened into genuine sisterly affection for perhaps the first time in either of their lives, that the Duke received an unexpected visitor of his own, his estranged sister, Lady Charlotte Vane, arriving at Ashcombe House with an urgency that immediately set the household on edge. Alara found herself present for the reunion between brother and sister, watching with quiet fascination as the Duke's carefully controlled composure cracked slightly at the sight of the woman he so rarely mentioned. "Charlotte," he said, his voice carrying an unfamiliar note of caution, "this is unexpected." "I would not have come if the matter were not urgent, Alistair," Lady Charlotte said, her eyes darting briefly toward Alara before returning to her brother. "I have learned something regarding Margaret's death that I believe you must hear, and I could not bring myself to commit it to a letter." The Duke's face paled visibly at the mention of his late wife's name, and Alara felt a cold premonition settle over her, sensing that whatever Lady Charlotte had discovered would soon test the fragile happiness she and the Duke had so carefully built together. Lady Charlotte Vane did not sit when invited. She stood near the window of the study, twisting her gloves in her hands, and Alara recognized in her the same careful stillness she had once seen in the Duke himself, the particular guardedness of someone who had learned early that trust was a dangerous luxury. "Perhaps I should leave the two of you to speak privately," Alara offered, though something in her did not wish to leave at all. "No," the Duke said quickly, reaching for her hand. "Whatever Charlotte has learned, I would rather you hear it as well. We agreed to honesty between us, and I do not intend to begin keeping secrets now." Lady Charlotte studied Alara for a long moment, something like approval settling into her expression before she finally spoke. "Very well. I will not waste time with preamble, Alistair. I have recently come into possession of letters written by Margaret in the weeks before her death, given to me by her former lady's maid, who has only now found the courage to share them, fearing for years that doing so might implicate her in matters she did not fully understand." The Duke's hand tightened around Alara's. "What do the letters say?" "That Margaret did not die attempting to flee a marriage she found unhappy, as you have believed all these years," Lady Charlotte said carefully. "She died fleeing our father." The silence that followed felt like something physical, pressing against the walls of the study. Alara watched the Duke's face drain of color entirely, his composed exterior cracking in a way she had never witnessed before, not even in his most vulnerable confessions by the fire. "Explain yourself, Charlotte," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Our father died 2 years before Margaret's accident." "Our father died 2 years before Margaret's accident," Lady Charlotte agreed. "But his influence did not die with him. According to these letters, Margaret discovered, shortly before her death, that our father had left behind considerable debts he had concealed from everyone, debts owed to dangerous men who did not concern themselves with the niceties of polite society when it came to collecting what they were owed. These men approached Margaret directly, believing that as your wife, she might have access to funds that could settle the debts quietly, without troubling you or damaging the family name further." "Why would they approach her rather than me?" the Duke demanded, his voice rising slightly, an intensity Alara had never before witnessed from him. "Because our father had convinced them, apparently, that you were unaware of his true financial situation, and that approaching you directly might result in the debts being refused entirely, or worse, exposed publicly," Lady Charlotte explained. "Margaret was frightened, Alistair. She wrote of being followed, of receiving threatening notes, of fearing for her safety and yours should the matter become known. She was traveling that night not to meet a lover, as you have believed all these years, but to meet with one of these men directly, attempting to negotiate some resolution on her own, out of fear that involving you would only escalate the danger." The Duke sat down heavily in his chair, his hands trembling slightly as he processed information that upended 2 years of carefully constructed guilt and self-blame. Alara moved closer, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, offering silent comfort as he struggled to absorb the full weight of what his sister had revealed. "I have spent 2 years believing I failed her as a husband," he said quietly, his voice rough with an emotion Alara had never heard from him before. "Believing my coldness drove her into another man's arms, that my inability to make her happy led directly to her death. And now, you tell me, she died trying to protect me from a danger I never even knew existed." "I am sorry, Alistair," Lady Charlotte said, her own composure finally cracking slightly. "I should have told you sooner, but I only recently learned the truth myself, and I did not know how to approach you with information that would so completely upend everything you believed." "Who were these men?" the Duke asked, his voice hardening with a controlled fury Alara recognized from his confrontation with her own father weeks before, though considerably more dangerous in its intensity. "Do the letters name them?" Margaret was careful not to name them directly, likely out of fear that the letters might be discovered, Lady Charlotte said. "But she mentions a location, a meeting place near the old mill outside the village where the accident occurred. I believe, if properly investigated, it may be possible to identify who these men were and hold them accountable for what happened." The Duke rose from his chair, pacing the length of the study with barely contained energy, and Alara watched the transformation with a mixture of concern and quiet admiration. Watching a man who had spent 2 years buried beneath misplaced guilt slowly begin to reclaim the anger and clarity that guilt had long suppressed. "I will need to see these letters," he said finally, turning to his sister. "All of them, and I will need to speak with Margaret's former lady's maid directly if she is willing." "She has agreed to speak with you," Lady Charlotte confirmed, though she remains frightened even now of what consequences might follow such conversations. "She will be protected," the Duke said firmly. "Whatever she requires to feel safe sharing what she knows, it will be provided." Alara watched this exchange with growing understanding of the depth of pain her husband had carried silently for 2 years, pain that had shaped the cold, guarded reputation he wore like armor throughout London society. She thought of her own 6 years of quiet suffering, the particular loneliness of carrying grief and injustice without anyone willing to acknowledge or address it, and felt a fierce, protective tenderness toward the man beside her that went far beyond anything she had anticipated feeling when their strange, practical arrangement had first begun. "I will help however I am able," Alara said, moving to stand beside the Duke, her voice steady despite the weight of the revelation still settling over the room. "Whatever needs to be done to uncover the truth and hold these men accountable, you will not face it alone." The Duke turned to her, something raw and grateful passing across his features before his usual composure began slowly to reassert itself. "Thank you, Alara. I confess I did not expect to find such steady support when this marriage began. I am deeply grateful for it now." Lady Charlotte remained at Ashcombe House for several days following her revelation, and Alara found herself growing increasingly fond of the Duke's sister, whose sharp wit and quiet resilience reminded her considerably of the Duke himself, softened by a warmth that suggested Charlotte had perhaps healed more successfully from their difficult shared childhood than her brother had managed. "He has always carried burdens too heavily," Charlotte confided to Alara one evening, while the Duke was occupied with correspondence in his study. "Our father taught us both that vulnerability was dangerous, that showing weakness invited exploitation. Alistair internalized that lesson more thoroughly than I ever did, I think, though I suspect our different responses to the same difficult childhood say more about circumstance than character. He has shown me considerable vulnerability these past weeks," Alara said quietly, watching the fire crackle in the hearth. "More, I suspect, than he has shown anyone since Margaret's death." "I am glad to hear it," Charlotte said, studying Alara with evident approval. "I confess I was skeptical when I first heard of this marriage, given the rather unusual circumstances of your courtship. But watching the two of you together these past days, I believe my brother has found something genuinely valuable in you, Alara. I hope you know how rare that is, for a man who has spent so long convinced that love only ever leads to loss." Alara felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, moved by the genuine warmth in Charlotte's words, so different from the transactional affection she had grown accustomed to from her own family. "Thank you, Charlotte. I hope to prove myself worthy of that trust, however long it takes." The investigation into Margaret's death proceeded carefully over the following weeks, the Duke working alongside a trusted solicitor, and eventually, a discreet investigator hired specifically to trace the identities of the men who had threatened his late wife. Alara watched her husband navigate this painful process with a strength that only deepened her admiration for him. His initial fury gradually settling into a determined, methodical pursuit of justice, rather than reckless vengeance. It was during this same period that a new complication arose, one Alara had not anticipated when she agreed to marry a man burdened by such complicated grief. Word of the investigation, despite the Duke's careful discretion, began circulating quietly through certain circles of London, reaching, eventually, the ears of Alara's own mother, who arrived unannounced at Ashcombe House one afternoon with an expression that immediately set Alara on guard. "I have heard the most extraordinary rumors," Lady Margaret announced, settling into the drawing-room without waiting to be properly invited. "Something about your husband investigating his first wife's death. Is there truth to these whispers, Alara?" "That is a private family matter, Mother," Alara said carefully, unwilling to share details of the Duke's painful history with a woman who had proven, repeatedly, that she could not be trusted to keep confidences when personal advantage was at stake. "Private matters have a way of becoming rather public when a duke is involved," Lady Margaret said pointedly. "I only wish to ensure our family's reputation does not suffer further complications, given everything this family has already endured on your behalf." The casual cruelty embedded in her mother's words, the implication that Alara's own troubled history remained a burden the family had generously carried rather than one they had actively created and perpetuated, struck with familiar, exhausting force. Alara felt something harden within her, a resolve that had been slowly building throughout the weeks of her marriage, finally crystallizing into words she had waited 6 years to speak aloud. "Mother," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling she felt beneath her composed exterior, "I believe it is time we spoke honestly about the nature of what this family has endured on my behalf, because I do not believe your version of events matches reality in the slightest." Lady Margaret's eyebrows rose in surprise at her daughter's uncharacteristically direct tone, but Alara continued before her mother could interrupt. "I did not create the scandal that destroyed my reputation at 16. Gideon did, through a lie he told to protect his own cowardice. You knew this, or at the very least suspected it strongly enough to investigate the truth, and you chose instead to believe the version that caused you the least inconvenience. You spent 6 years treating me as though I were a stain upon this family's honor, when in truth, the only stain was your own willingness to sacrifice my happiness rather than confront an uncomfortable truth about your own nephew." "Alara," her mother began, clearly startled by this unprecedented confrontation, "I hardly think—" "I'm not finished, Mother," Alara continued, her voice growing steadier with each word. "I have watched you transform, in the span of a few short weeks, from a woman who called me the family's greatest shame into a woman who addresses me as my dear, purely because my circumstances changed in a way that benefits your own ambitions. I do not believe your affection for me has genuinely changed at all. I believe you have simply recognized that I have become useful to you once more. I will not pretend otherwise simply to preserve a comfortable fiction that spares your feelings." The drawing-room fell into a heavy, unfamiliar silence. Lady Margaret's face cycled through several emotions: shock, defensive anger, and finally, something that might have been the beginning of genuine shame, though Alara had learned long ago not to place too much hope in her mother's capacity for genuine self-reflection. "I have made mistakes," Lady Margaret said finally, her voice smaller than Alara had ever heard it. "I will not pretend I have been a perfect mother to you, Alara. But I am your mother nonetheless, and I have hoped, these past weeks, that perhaps we might find our way toward something better between us." "I would welcome that genuinely," Alara said, softening slightly despite herself. "But it must be built on honesty, Mother, not on the convenient fiction that nothing occurred between us that requires acknowledgement or apology. If you wish for a genuine relationship with me going forward, it must begin with you acknowledging the harm you caused, rather than simply expecting me to forget it because circumstances have changed in your favor." Lady Margaret said nothing for a long moment, staring at her hands folded in her lap, and Alara watched her mother's careful composure crack, however briefly, into something that resembled genuine vulnerability. "I do not know how to begin such an acknowledgement," she admitted quietly. "I have spent so many years convincing myself that my treatment of you was justified, that I hardly know how to examine it honestly now." "Perhaps you might begin simply," Alara suggested gently, "by telling me you are sorry and meaning it." "I am sorry, Alara," Lady Margaret said, and for the first time in Alara's memory, the words carried genuine weight rather than careless obligation. "I am sorry for believing the worst of you when I should have investigated the truth. I am sorry for 6 years of treating you as though your presence in this family were something to be ashamed of, when in truth, watching the woman you have become these past weeks, I believe you are the finest of my daughters, and I was simply too blind or too proud to recognize it sooner." Alara felt tears finally spill over, 6 years of accumulated grief and longing finding release in this single, imperfect moment of genuine acknowledgement. It did not erase the past, she knew. It did not undo 6 years of loneliness and quiet suffering. But it was perhaps a beginning, fragile and uncertain, but genuine nonetheless, and Alara found herself willing, cautiously, to accept it as such. She did not yet know that the Duke's investigation into Margaret's death was about to reveal a connection far closer to her own family than either of them could have anticipated, nor that the truth, when it finally emerged in full, would test every fragile bond of trust she had worked so carefully to rebuild. The investigator arrived at Ashcombe House on a gray autumn afternoon, requesting a private audience with the Duke that Alara was, this time, invited to attend without hesitation. Mr. Callum Bennet was a quiet, methodical man whose careful manner reminded Alara somewhat of the Duke himself, and he spread a series of documents across the study desk, with the deliberate precision of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news carefully. "Your Grace," he began, "I have traced the identity of the men who approached your late wife before her death. It was, as your sister suspected, connected to debts left behind by your father, though the full picture proved considerably more complicated than initially understood." "Go on," the Duke said, his composure carefully maintained, though Alara could see the tension in his shoulders as he braced for whatever revelation was about to follow. "Your father's debts were owed to a moneylender operating outside the usual channels of respectable finance, a man who has since died, though his associates remain active," Mr. Bennet explained. "However, the connection between this moneylender and your late wife proved more direct than mere coincidence. Your father's original debts were incurred, in part, through investments made alongside another gentleman of your acquaintance, a man who subsequently found himself in similarly precarious financial circumstances, and who has continued borrowing from dangerous sources in the years since." Alara felt a cold, creeping dread settle over her even before Mr. Bennet spoke the name, some instinctive recognition of where this revelation was inevitably heading. "The gentleman's name," Mr. Bennet continued, glancing briefly toward Alara with evident reluctance, "is Lord Edmund Whitmore." The silence that followed felt like the air had been entirely pulled from the room. Alara stared at the investigator, waiting for some clarification that would soften the blow of what she had just heard, but none came. "My father," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "my father was connected to the men who threatened Margaret. Not directly involved in the threats themselves, as far as I have been able to determine," Mr. Bennet clarified quickly. "But his financial entanglements with the same disreputable lender created the network through which these men operated. It is possible, even likely, that Lord Edmund was entirely unaware of the specific threats made against the late Duchess. However, his continued borrowing from these same sources, including the reckless investment that recently cost your family so dearly, has kept this dangerous network active and operational for years longer than it might otherwise have remained." Alara sat down heavily, her mind reeling with the implications of this revelation. Her father's poor judgment, the same recklessness that had nearly cost her family everything just weeks before, was somehow connected to the very tragedy that had shaped so much of the Duke's guarded, grief-stricken existence over the past 2 years. It felt in that moment, as though every painful thread of both their histories had somehow woven together into a single, devastating tapestry neither of them had anticipated. "Alistair," she said quietly, turning to her husband, uncertain what she might find in his expression. "I did not know. I swear to you, I had no knowledge of any connection between my father and Margaret's death." The Duke reached for her hand immediately, his gray eyes steady and reassuring despite the obvious shock still processing behind them. "I do not for a moment believe you knew, Alara. This is not your burden to carry, whatever connection exists between our families." "But it changes things," Alara said, her voice trembling slightly. "It means my family's recklessness contributed even indirectly to your suffering, to Margaret's death. It means my father's recklessness and yours both fed into the same dangerous network of desperate men," the Duke corrected gently. "It does not mean you bear any responsibility for choices made by two men who cared more for their own ambitions than for the safety of those around them." Mr. Bennet cleared his throat carefully, drawing their attention back to the matter at hand. "There is more, Your Grace. I have identified the specific individuals who approached the late Duchess directly, and I believe with proper legal action they can be held accountable for the intimidation that ultimately led to her fatal accident. It will require careful handling, given the sensitive nature of the connections involved, but justice remains achievable." "Proceed with whatever legal action is necessary," the Duke said firmly. "I do not care how sensitive the connections prove to be. Margaret deserves justice, regardless of whose family history complicates the pursuit of it." The following weeks brought a flurry of careful legal proceedings, conducted with as much discretion as the circumstances allowed, though rumors inevitably began circulating through London society regarding the surprising connections uncovered in the investigation. Alara found herself navigating an entirely new kind of scrutiny, no longer whispered about as the family's shameful secret, but discussed instead as the unwitting connection between two tragic family histories finally receiving the justice they deserved. Her father, confronted directly with the revelation of his own role in the tragedy, reacted with a mixture of horror and genuine remorse that surprised Alara, given his usual capacity for self-serving justification. "I did not know," Lord Edmund insisted, sitting across from Alara and the Duke in a meeting arranged specifically to address the difficult revelation. "I swear before God, I had no knowledge that my dealings with that lender connected in any way to threats made against your late wife. Had I known, I would have." He stopped, unable to complete the sentence, and Alara watched something genuinely broken settle into her father's expression. A recognition, perhaps for the first time, of how thoroughly his own poor choices had rippled outward to cause harm he had never intended nor anticipated. "I believe you," the Duke said finally, his voice measured but not unkind. "I do not believe you orchestrated Margaret's death, Lord Edmund, but I would ask that you consider, going forward, how your financial recklessness has repeatedly caused harm to those around you, including your own daughter, who has spent years bearing consequences for choices that were never hers to make." Lord Edmund nodded slowly, something like genuine shame settling over his features. "I have not been a good father to Alara. I recognize that now, perhaps more fully than I ever have before. I do not know how to properly make amends for 6 years of failing her so completely, but I would like the opportunity to try, if she is willing to permit it." Alara studied her father's face carefully, searching for any trace of the calculated performance she had grown so accustomed to over the years, and found, to her genuine surprise, something that felt authentic, a man finally confronting the full weight of choices he had spent years avoiding examination. "I would be willing to try as well," she said finally, "but it must be built on honesty going forward, Father. I have had enough of pretense to last several lifetimes." The legal proceedings against the men who had threatened Margaret concluded several weeks later, resulting in convictions that finally brought the closure the Duke had spent 2 years unknowingly seeking. Alara watched her husband navigate the difficult process of finally releasing guilt he had carried for so long, watched the gradual softening of tension in his shoulders, the increasing frequency of genuine smiles that no longer felt rare or hard-won, but natural, easy, a permanent fixture of the man he was becoming now that the truth had finally set him free from years of misplaced self-blame. "I keep thinking of all the time I lost," he confessed to Alara one evening, as they walked together through the restored rose gardens that had become their favorite refuge for honest conversation. 2 years spent believing I had failed Margaret so completely that she preferred danger and flight to remaining in our marriage. 2 years I might have spent healing, had I known the truth sooner. "You cannot reclaim that time," Alara said gently, taking his hand as they walked. "But you need not lose any more of it now that the truth has finally emerged. You have the rest of your life ahead of you, Alistair, and I intend to spend as much of it as you will allow me, helping you build something genuinely happy rather than merely surviving beneath the weight of grief." The Duke stopped walking, turning to face her fully among the roses that had first brought them together months before, his gray eyes warm with an emotion that no longer required careful interpretation, an emotion Alara had come to recognize, unmistakably, as love. "I did not expect to find this," he said quietly, reaching up to gently cup her face in his hands. "When I first proposed this marriage, I told you I could offer respect and partnership, but I did not dare hope for genuine happiness. I did not believe myself capable of it any longer, not after everything I had lost. You have proven me wrong in every possible way, Alara Whitmore, and I find myself more grateful for that error than I can properly express." "I did not expect it either," Alara admitted, tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes. "I spent 6 years believing myself unworthy of genuine affection, convinced that whatever love I might find would always come with conditions attached, always require me to earn my place through usefulness rather than simply being valued for who I am. You have shown me otherwise, Alistair, every single day since that first morning in this garden." "Then let me show you formally and without any doubt remaining," the Duke said, drawing her closer. "I love you, Alara. Not as a convenient arrangement, not as a practical solution to my need for an heir, but as the woman who taught me that vulnerability need not always lead to loss. That honesty could build something stronger than any wall I had ever constructed to protect myself from further grief." "I love you as well," Alara said, the words emerging with a certainty that surprised even herself, though she recognized in that moment that she had been feeling this truth for weeks without fully allowing herself to name it. "Completely and without reservation." The Duke kissed her then, gently at first, then with a growing warmth that spoke of months of careful, patient courtship finally blossoming into the genuine love neither of them had dared hope to find when their strange, practical arrangement had first begun. Around them, the restored roses bloomed in the late afternoon light, a fitting testament to the slow, careful work of tending something broken until it finally, unmistakably, thrived. Yet even as Alara allowed herself to fully embrace this hard-won happiness, she could not entirely release the knowledge that one final reckoning still awaited them both. A public reckoning that would require confronting, once and for all, the family that had spent 6 years calling her their greatest shame, before the entire watching eyes of London society. The invitation arrived embossed in gold, requesting the presence of the Duke and Duchess of Ashcombe at the grandest ball London had hosted in years. An event organized by the Duke himself for reasons he had, until that morning, kept entirely private from Alara. "You planned this without telling me?" Alara asked, turning the invitation over in her hands, reading her own name printed alongside the Duke's for the entire ton to see. "I wanted to be certain of the details before involving you," the Duke said, watching her reaction carefully. "This ball serves a specific purpose, Alara, one I believe you deserve to witness fully realized rather than simply anticipated in advance." "What purpose?" Alara asked, though something in her husband's expression suggested she already suspected the answer. "A formal, public acknowledgement," the Duke said, "of everything London has misunderstood about you these past 6 years. I have arranged for the true circumstances of your cousin's lie to be revealed publicly, along with acknowledgement of your father's genuine remorse, and confirmation of the justice finally secured regarding Margaret's death. I want all of London to understand, beyond any possibility of continued whispered doubt, exactly who you truly are, and exactly how thoroughly they have wronged you through 6 years of unfounded gossip. Alara felt tears gather unexpectedly in her eyes, moved beyond words by the depth of consideration behind her husband's careful planning. You did not need to do this for me, Alistair. I have already found more happiness in this marriage than I ever believed possible. I do not require London's approval to feel whole. I know you do not require it, the Duke said gently, drawing her close. But you deserve it nonetheless, Alara. You deserve to walk into any room in London and be greeted with the respect that should have been yours all along, rather than whispered speculation about a scandal that was never your doing. Allow me this, please. It is perhaps the truest expression of love I know how to offer. The night of the ball arrived with a clear autumn sky. Stars scattered brilliantly overhead as carriages began arriving at Ashcombe House in numbers that suggested the entire fashionable world of London had turned out for the occasion. Alara stood before her mirror in a gown of deep emerald silk, watching Bridget carefully arrange the last few pins in her hair, and felt none of the anxious dread that had once accompanied every social occasion of her youth. "You look every inch a duchess, miss," Bridget said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "More than that, if I may say so, you look like a woman who has finally claimed the happiness she always deserved." "Thank you, Bridget," Alara said, squeezing her old friend's hand warmly. "For everything these past years. I do not believe I could have survived them without your quiet kindness." She descended the grand staircase of Ashcombe House to find the Duke waiting at the bottom, dressed in formal black that made his gray eyes seem even more striking beneath the glow of countless candles. He watched her descend with an expression of open admiration that no longer required careful interpretation, that spoke plainly and without reservation of a love that had grown steadily stronger with each passing month. "You are breathtaking," he said simply, taking her hand as she reached the final step. "You say that every time," Alara said, smiling despite the flutter of nervous anticipation building in her chest. "Because it remains entirely true every time," the Duke replied, leading her toward the ballroom where the assembled crowd had already begun to notice their arrival. The evening unfolded exactly as the Duke had planned, though with a grace and dignity that avoided anything resembling public humiliation for those involved. He addressed the assembled crowd directly during a formal toast, speaking plainly of the injustice his wife had suffered through 6 years of unfounded rumor, confirming that the scandal attributed to her at 16 had been entirely the fabrication of a cowardly relative seeking to protect his own reputation. He spoke, too, of the justice recently secured regarding his late wife's tragic death, acknowledging openly the role that reckless financial dealings, including those of Alara's own father, had inadvertently played in creating the dangerous circumstances that led to her accident, while carefully noting that Lord Edmund had shown genuine remorse and taken meaningful steps toward reform in the months since. Alara watched the assembled crowd's reaction with quiet satisfaction, watched years of whispered judgment slowly transform into something closer to respect, even admiration, as the true shape of her history finally became known. Lucinda, standing near the edge of the gathered crowd, offered a small, genuine smile that suggested perhaps even her sister's long-standing resentment might finally begin to soften now that the truth had been so publicly established. Her mother stood nearby, her expression carrying none of the calculated performance Alara had grown so accustomed to over the years, but something that looked, remarkably, like genuine pride. "To my wife," the Duke concluded, raising his glass toward Alara across the crowded ballroom, "who taught me that true worth is never diminished by the cruelty of others, only revealed more clearly through how gracefully one endures it. I am the most fortunate man in London to call her mine." The crowd erupted into applause, and Alara felt the last remaining shadows of 6 years of quiet suffering finally, fully dissolve beneath the warmth of genuine celebration, no longer whispered about as the family's greatest shame, but honored, publicly and unequivocally, as the woman a cold duke had chosen not despite her difficult history, but because of the strength and grace with which she had survived it. They danced together beneath the glittering chandeliers as the orchestra played long into the night, and Alara found herself laughing freely, genuinely, in a way she had not permitted herself in years, surrounded by a love she had never dared believe herself worthy of receiving. Later that evening, as the guests began to depart and the ballroom slowly emptied, the Duke led Alara out onto the terrace overlooking the moonlit gardens, the same roses she had spent months carefully restoring now blooming beautifully beneath the silver light. "Thank you," Alara said softly, leaning into her husband's embrace as they looked out over the gardens together, "for everything you have given me these past months. I did not know, when I agreed to this marriage, how thoroughly you would transform not just my circumstances, but my entire understanding of what I deserved from life." "You have given me equally as much," the Duke replied, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "I was a man frozen by grief and guilt when we first met, Alara, convinced I would never again experience genuine happiness. You thawed something in me I believed permanently lost. I owe you a debt I do not believe I could ever fully repay." "Perhaps we might simply consider ourselves even," Alara suggested, smiling up at him. "Two broken people who somehow found their way toward healing together." "Not broken," the Duke corrected gently. "Merely waiting for the right person to see what remained whole beneath the damage others had inflicted." They stood together on the terrace for a long while, watching the stars scattered brilliantly across the clear autumn sky, both of them finally, fully at peace with a future neither had dared imagine when their strange, practical arrangement had first begun. The family's greatest shame had become the Duke's most treasured possession, not through any transformation of who she fundamentally was, but through the simple, powerful act of finally being seen, valued, and chosen exactly as she had always been. Spring arrived at Ashcombe House with a gentleness that felt entirely fitting for the new chapter, unfolding within its walls. Alara stood once more among her roses, though this time she was not alone, watching her husband kneel beside her, his hands, once so unfamiliar with such humble work, now steady and practiced as he helped her tend the very garden that had first drawn his attention nearly a year before. "You have become rather skilled at this," Alara teased, watching him carefully prune a stubborn branch exactly as she had taught him. "I have had an excellent teacher," the Duke replied, glancing up at her with the easy warmth that had become his natural expression, so different from the guarded coldness London had once whispered about with such certainty. Much had changed in the months since their public reconciliation with the truth of Alara's history. Rosalind had completed a successful season, securing a genuine, affectionate match with a kind gentleman who valued her sharp wit and gentle nature far more than her family's improved fortunes. Lucinda, humbled by months of quiet reflection, had begun writing to Alara with a warmth that felt, increasingly, authentic rather than calculated, the two sisters slowly rebuilding a relationship neither had believed possible during their difficult shared childhood. Even Lady Margaret had shown genuine, sustained effort toward repairing the damage of 6 neglectful years, visiting regularly, listening more than she spoke, gradually earning back a measure of the trust she had so thoroughly forfeited. Lord Edmund, humbled by the revelation of his role in the tragedy that had shaped so much of the Duke's grief, had taken meaningful steps toward reform, working diligently under the careful oversight the Duke had insisted upon, slowly rebuilding both his finances and his relationship with the daughter he had failed for so many years. Gideon Whitmore, his cowardly lie finally exposed to the full scrutiny of London society, had found himself quietly shunned by the very circles he had once feared losing standing within, a consequence Alara found she could accept without malice, understanding that justice, however delayed, carried its own quiet satisfaction without requiring her active participation in its unfolding. Lady Charlotte had become a frequent and beloved presence at Ashcombe House, her sharp humor and genuine warmth adding a lightness to family gatherings that Alara treasured deeply, grateful for a sister-in-law who had shown her nothing but genuine kindness from their very first meeting. The investigation into Margaret's death had concluded with full justice finally served. The dangerous men responsible for her fear and flight held properly accountable under the law, allowing the Duke to finally release 2 years of misplaced guilt in favor of genuine, peaceful remembrance of the young woman he had once, imperfectly, loved. "I received a letter this morning," Alara said, settling onto the small garden bench while the Duke continued his careful work among the roses. "From a physician in London. It seems our family may be growing sooner than we anticipated." The Duke's hand stilled immediately, his gray eyes lifting to meet hers with an expression of such open, unguarded joy that Alara felt her own heart swell with matching happiness. "You are certain?" "As certain as the physician's examination allows," Alara confirmed, smiling as her husband rose quickly and crossed the small distance between them, kneeling before her bench to take both her hands in his. "I did not believe myself capable of feeling this kind of happiness again," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have given me more than I ever dared hope for, Alara. A genuine marriage, a family healed of old wounds, and now, a child to carry our love forward into the future. We built this together," Alara reminded him gently, cupping his face in her hands. "Every part of it, the garden, the healing, the love we found in each other despite everything that once stood between us. I do not believe either of us could have found this happiness alone." "Then let us continue building it together," the Duke said, pressing a tender kiss to her palm. "For the rest of our lives, and for the child who will never know the particular loneliness either of us once carried, because they will grow up surrounded by a love neither of us believed ourselves worthy of receiving, until we finally found it in each other." The roses bloomed brilliantly around them that spring, tended with the same patient, devoted care that had transformed a neglected garden into something flourishing and beautiful, much as it had transformed 2 guarded, wounded hearts into something whole. The woman London had once called the family's greatest shame had become, in the end, exactly what the cold Duke had recognized in her from that very first muddy morning among the roses. Not a stain to be hidden away, but a strength waiting patiently to be seen, valued, and finally, completely chosen.